Warmest greetings to our viewers and listeners on the various platforms. Welcome to this, our first discussion panel of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series 2022. I'm your moderator for this session. I'm Claudius Fergus, Director for Education and Research in the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. This series has been a regular feature of the annual Pan-African Festival since the 1990s. The series honors the name of the great civil rights and freedom fighter, Kwame Ture. By the way, the Emancipation Support Committee is celebrating 30 years this year, 30 years, and we are invoking the philosophy of diligence and perseverance. Diligence and perseverance. You may post your comments and questions as the discussion proceeds. You need not necessarily have to wait till the end, and we promise to address as many as possible. This panel will address the very important historic and current topic, discrimination in education, toward permanent solutions for the African child. Let me say to the viewers that we will also appreciate suggestions from you on solutions going forward. This panel is not an end in itself. It is the beginning of a new commitment to justice and equity for the African child. Discrimination in education, of course, is not unique to the Caribbean and the Americas, but wherever Africans would have been subjected to the yoke of colonialism. It is remarkable that Africans in Africa have had a similar history of discrimination that goes back to the beginning of the European missionary schooling era in Africa. But Africans have been fighting back. We also have to fight back. Let me give you one example. In southern Nigeria, children are mandated to style their hair naturally to attend school. Here you see the daughter of top comedy content maker Mark Angel stepping out to school in her puff-puff hairstyle. And it's his real daughter, actually. The following week, her school would be told, her fellow students would be told by her school what hairstyle to wear for that week. I'm not saying we have to follow that model, but I'm suggesting that there are remedies of various kinds that are there already that we can ponder on. In this panel, we will hear about a natural hair revolution in Ghana. For today's panel, we have two keynote speakers who will lead the discussion. Now, because of the political developments in Anguilla, very recent political developments, we are unable to bring you the Honorable Minister of Education of Anguilla, Mrs. Deanne Kentish Rogers. Taking a place as the opening feature speaker is the venerable activist, Brother Shabaka Kambon. He will be followed by Reverend Dr. Patricia Seeley. Brother Shabaka is a communication specialist. He is the CEO and founding director of the Crossroads Freedom Project. He has led the current struggle for non-discrimination of African hairstyles in schools in Trinidad and Tobago. He also plays a major role in the Emancipation Support Committee's annual outreach to schools and in contributing to decolonizing their minds, a subject that is conspicuously absent from the syllabus of a post-colonial state. In fact, you may say a neo-colonial state. Currently, He is leading the advocacy to rid Trinidad and Tobago of memorials to one of the most violent criminal dictators of the region, Thomas Picton, the first British governor of Trinidad. Dr. Patricia Seeley is a deacon in the Anglican Church and assistant professor at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, that is UTT. She has 50 years of active service in the field of education, functioning at every level, from primary to policymaking. She was an education specialist in curriculum development and teaching and learning strategies within the secondary education modernization program. She has extensive experience in developing curricula in sociology and health and family life education. Her publications cover areas in curriculum engineering, social policies, social studies, and teacher training. She has co-chaired many national stakeholder conferences on education and conducted workshops for pre-service and in-service teachers at secondary and tertiary levels, both locally and internationally. She's an advocate also for the empowerment of the marginalized and dispossessed. Let us welcome both keynote speakers. Each speaker has 15 minutes, and I ask them to please keep an eye on the timing. So let me ask Brother Shabaka to address the viewers and the audience. Welcome, brother. Proceed. Unmute.
There we go. Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction, Dr. Fergus. And of course, you know, I want to take every opportunity to celebrate those academics who leave the ivory towers to use their knowledge to empower the people. So thank you again, Dr. Fergus. Special greetings to Sister Zakia Wadada, the chair of the Emancipation Support Committee, to my fellow keynote speaker, Dr. Patricia Seeley, to our respondents, Brother Adeyemi Hines, Brother Kwame Kamau, Brother Reverend Kwame Kamau, Sister Akende Rudder, to all our brothers and sisters at home and abroad. Let me start quickly by apologizing on behalf of the Emancipation Support Committee for not having Sister Minister Kentish Rogers with us this afternoon. I am as disappointed as you are that we don't have the benefit of engaging her today. She is famous, having put up that Facebook post in April, where she remarked that as an elected official, a young man turned to her and asked, "How can you head the Ministry of Education and wear locks, but students in the system cannot?" And that penetrating question, she said, led to a revision of the National Code of Discipline and Dress. Ms. Kentish Rogers has overseen the most progressive legislation in the region to date. And so it would have been indeed a pleasure for all of us concerned to have had her with us this evening. Wherever she is and whatever she's doing right now, we want to send our profound love and best wishes. So let's put this thing in proper context, and it's 5:09. We start there. On May 5th, 1962, the Black Shining Prince, El Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz, better known by his beloved name, Brother Malcolm X, was at the funeral service of Ronald Stokes, a brother who was killed by the police in Los Angeles. And he asked the mourners there some profound questions. Who taught you to hate the color of your skin? Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the way God made you? This was 1 year after Frantz Fanon's seminal text, The Wretched of the Earth, was published. It put colonial violence in the spotlight, exploring its inner workings and the role its inner workings beyond the military, economic, and political aspects. Self-hate in Fanon's formulation was related to colonial violence, was a byproduct of colonial violence, which was enacted on or through knowledge, what we call today epistemic violence. He spent a lot of time, the great Caribbean intellectual, scholar, playwright, humanist, on the framework or ideas that underpinned the imperialist project. Ideas which he identified as vilifying and criminalizing the quote unquote natives' knowledge and knowledge systems, cultural and spiritual practices, languages, forms of dress, and even the way our hair grew out of our heads naturally. Interestingly, in his book, he also predicts, and this will be for later on in the presentation, the inability of the first batch of post-independence leaders to grapple with these issues. Now, I want you to get a glimpse of what this looked like in the colonial period. And as such, I've been fortunate to find a diary of a Scottish physician, Dr. Vincent Tothill, who signed up with the colonial service in the 1920s and came to Trinidad, where he eventually set up a private practice. This is what he observed. He said, among the colored people, and colored people would have ranged from brown skin to people who were indistinguishable today, would be indistinguishable today from white Trinidadians. Among the colored people, I have often heard it said that the social grades are very exacting and are based on the amount of colored blood in them. I have noticed one very curious thing, he points out. It seems to be the hair and not the color that is the real social bar. This is Dr. Vincent Tothill making his observations in the 1920s. And he goes on to say that he observed that women who have Afro-textured hair will spend all they possess to get it straightened. One of the unacknowledged costs of white supremacy in our society. What Dr. Tothill identified was the norm across the Americas at the beginning of the 20th century, something that is still sadly too prevalent up to today. The Right Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey was like a voice in the wilderness in that period when he said, take the kinks out of your mind, not your hair. So we find the roots of contemporary hair discrimination when we trace the lines of colonial violence. And we know that Caribbean people of color, particularly African people, whose hair was identified as the ultimate other, would have entered the 20th century under tremendous pressure to conform in all spheres of their lives with ethnocentric norms of what finished, professional, respectable, or beautiful hair looked like. And that it cost them a fortune over the decades to continue to conform to those norms. To be clear, what is at issue here is the widespread, pernicious, and fundamentally racist belief that the hair and hairstyles of African people are not beautiful, not suitable for formal settings, and are intrinsically messy, unkempt, unhygienic, and even disruptive. The first time this orthodoxy was challenged was in the 1960s and 70s as part of the consciousness associated with the Black Power movement. The bold afro soon gave way to a proliferation of other natural hairstyles. The second time was in the 2010s, within the growing consciousness that would eventually manifest itself in the Black Lives Matter movement. It was also underpinned at that time by a growing awareness of the health risks associated with the chemicals in hair straightening products and dyes and the extensive use of weaves. And by the way, when we talk about those health risks, we're talking about risks that go all the way through to the reproductive system. And some of the things that, some of the problems that are endemic in the reproductive system with African women, it is believed that those chemicals contribute to those things. And no wonder they are endemic because of the fact that children from the time they're 9 years old have to submit to these kinds of treatments according to what the society demands of them. Academic studies in the United States of America in particular have explored the extent of the problem, and these also played an important role in the growing consciousness. So by the time you had the high-profile case of the 16-year-old wrestler Andrew Johnson, who was forced to submit to having a white female trainer cut his locks in front of everyone in a stadium to be able to compete in a match for his school in 2019, there were already several studies done that highlighted the extent of the problem. Many of these studies focus on Black women, who, it turns out, are 83% more likely to report being judged more harshly on their looks than other women. 80% agonize over their hair before entering any working environment. 30% are more likely to have been made aware of a workplace appearance policy. Those with locks, twists, or braids are deemed less professional and are less likely to land job interviews. A whole 1/3 of Black women say that they have personally faced discrimination because of wearing their hair in its natural state. So all these academic studies that deal with all, and I've just touched on a few of the findings, there are many, many more, show that this thing is rampant and widespread. And of course, this has led those in charge of the movement to seek solutions that transcend traditional consciousness raising, marching, fists in the air, and demanding change. On July 3rd, 2019, there was indeed a very important turning point for racial and social justice when California's governor, Gavin Newsom, signed the Create a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair, or CROWN Act, into law. This, let me just say, was not just important for the United States of America, but for African people all across the America, because the legislation bans discrimination against Black hair and hairstyles such as locks, cornrows, twists, braids, bantu knots, fades, and afros. In August, shortly after California, New York followed with similar legislation carrying serious penalties up to $250,000 under one law and unlimited damages under another. More than a dozen states have already passed this legislation aimed at banning race discrimination of hair in employment, housing, school, and in the military. And efforts are now underway to have CROWN legislation passed at the federal level. It is in fact before Congress as we speak in the United States of America. So what's happening in the Caribbean? Well, we come from a space where people like to pretend that this is not our problem. They're happy. The authorities like to look at what's happening in the United States of America and say that this is their problem. It doesn't affect us. Their situation is somehow unique in the Americas. Not as if we actually exported slavery to them. But a cursory look at the headlines around the world will demonstrate that this issue is not an American problem, but a global problem, a problem that follows colonialism, the violence of colonialism, wherever it went. Who could forget Miss Universe South Africa 2019, Zozibini Tunzi, who came out and publicly forgave those who advised her to wear weave for the pageant, saying that they were just repeating what society had engraved in our minds for such a long time, before adding, beauty does not look one certain way. In 2016, girls in Pretoria High in South Africa were told to straighten their hair, and protests in that school and other schools were ongoing when Zozibini made her famous statement in 2019. Here in the Caribbean, we have seen several recent high-profile incidents in Barbados 2015 and 2016, the Bahamas 2016, Jamaica 2018 and 2019, Belize 2018, 2019, 2020, 2022, and Trinidad, several incidents over the years going back into the 1990s. With the latest being at St. Stephen's College in 2019. Now, these issues that make the newspapers, I want to explain, are just the tip of the iceberg. Most of the hair discrimination that takes place in the Caribbean goes unacknowledged in the press. I did a radio interview in 2019 on the Emancipation Support Committee's show in Daba, the place where knowledge grows. I was supposed to have two mothers of boys in primary school. One of them showed up, one didn't make it to the interview. She talked up on the program about a child whose hair was less than 1 centimeter long. In fact, she brought the boy to introduce me to him and described an ordeal in which the teachers repeatedly harassed the child and eventually called her in to ask him to say that his hair was unkempt and that he needed a haircut. And when she went in, just like the other mother who was supposed to be on the program, very similar story, two different schools, she was told that she noticed that the Indian mixed children and so on had longer hair, much longer hair, in fact, down to their shoulders, and they were not asked to cut their hair. On that program, on that Indaba show as well, I had a secondary school girl who went to Bishop's, who's going to Bishop's Honesty today. And she talked about her experience in her primary school, another one of the prestigious primary schools in this country, where she was routinely harassed by the teachers for when she decided to go natural and to wear her hair out, while her white and Indian friends had their hair out every single day in its natural form. Her hair was considered to be distracting by the teachers. And in fact, one teacher actually told her that she had to keep it down because children behind her couldn't see the blackboard when she combed her hair out. I had a boy from another prestigious secondary school who talked about the ongoing discrimination he was facing there. And I inquired of him recently, and he said it continues to today. Just 2 days ago, when Dr. Fergus asked me to take on this role here, a family called me, and I asked them about their child, and they told me they had gone to enter him into a Christian school in the East. And when they got there, the teachers told them that he would have to cut his hair. And when they looked around, they saw the same phenomenon that other parents had seen, the inequality in treatment, and decided they would homeschool the boy. So they told me that their son was being homeschooled to escape that kind of judgment. So in all these cases, Caribbean officials are more concerned with pretending we do not have a problem and upholding hegemonic standards grounded in white supremacy than addressing the epidemic of chemical relaxers that have been linked in recent scientific studies with uterine fibroids, cancer, and early hair loss, among other things, or the broader cultural and racial discrimination around African hair that is impacting young boys and girls at a critical stage in their development, disrupting their education and crippling their self-esteem before most of them even begin to understand the political and historical forces that shape the social constructs that they will have to navigate in order to succeed in this world. In a piece published early in 2020, Dr. Claudius Fergus rightly criticized the conduct of the authorities in the face of all the efforts made to get them to address the issue, saying that the scale of natural justice weighs negatively against the Ministry of Education in this country for allowing 2019 to end without unambiguously prohibiting discrimination against natural hair, hair texture, and basic African hairstyles, and mandating school administrators to root out the practice wherever it rears its ugly head. He was speaking at the end of a year in which civil society took up the case of Kalika Morton after her case of discrimination over a 2-year period for wearing natural hairstyles at St. Stephen's College made national headlines. How many people remember the November 12th article in the Trinidad Express where Minister Franklin Kahn claimed that the matter was resolved? When we in the Caribbean Freedom Project and the ESC investigated, we found this claim to be baseless. We learned that up to today, up to that day, when the article was published, the Ministry of Education had not had the courtesy to communicate directly with Ms. Leslie Morton Taylor about her daughter's case. Miss Taylor, the widow of the late West Indies and national cricketer Ronoko Morton, had to learn about developments along with the general public by reading the newspapers. She was not alone, of course, since no other individual or group who had championed this issue, including Sister Akende, who is on the panel today, had been treated any differently by officials in this country. In the case of the Emancipation Support Committee on October 9th, the ESCTT wrote to Minister Anthony Garcia, who I had the pleasure of interacting with personally. What a waste of hot air. We spoke to him. We wrote him calling for the establishment of a task force to look into the issue across all schools, to quote, as a matter of urgency. The ESC stating, we know for a fact that what happened at St. Stephen's was not an isolated incident. Up to today, the ESCTT, like the Morton Taylor family, has not received a reply from the ministry. Officials have steadfastly snubbed the whole spectrum of Afro-Trinidadian civil society groups that have called for action and ignored interventions from high-profile citizens of African descent, like Facebook's Global Chief Diversity Officer, Maxine Williams, who said that her natural hair had been an issue in the society for as long as I could remember. This callous disregard actually created a disadvantageous environment for Ms. Morton Taylor and for everyone else in the society who was grappling with the issue. And of course, this disadvantageous environment came back to haunt Ms. Taylor when an official at the St. Stephen's College issued her with a pre-action protocol letter threatening legal action. At issue here is the national anxiety around colonial legacy racial issues. And, I could give so many examples, but we'll save that for the question and answer period. And the way that this masks the widespread, pernicious, and fundamentally racist attitudes that persist around the hair and hairstyles of African people. As we said, not suitable for formal settings, intrinsically messy, unkempt, unhygienic, etc. The insidious nature of this deeply ingrained idea is encapsulated in a popular phrase, bad hair. And this guarantees that every conversation about grooming hair ends up being a larger conversation about race. Our findings are that the current legislation is insufficient. In this environment where ethnocentric colonial era values are protected by ignorance and apathy, generic guidelines which promote sensitivity to diversity do not prevent teachers and principals from making judgments that violate the civil rights of children with Afro-textured hair. It doesn't protect them in South Africa, it doesn't protect them in Nigeria, it doesn't protect them in the United States of America, Venezuela, Brazil, or anywhere in the Caribbean. In an impassioned letter to the editor of The Observer, published on June 22nd, 2021, Jamaican attorney at law Matthew Hyatt recalled his own frustrating experience at school under the current dispensation of legislation. He says in 2010, I was a victim of this discriminatory practice of being asked to cut my hair just minutes before the start of my Caribbean secondary education certificate mathematics examination at a prominent all-male high school in the corporate area. He talks about being marched to the principal's office to have his hair cut just before that exam, saying, I was almost distraught. I was most distraught as I watched some of my Caucasian, Indian, and Chinese peers with long straight hair begin their exams without any inquiries. It's so predictable. I seem to have, there must be a problem here. Let me see what's the matter. Hold on a second. Yes, Sister Nzinga?
Wrap up.
Okay. Right, I'm wrapping up. I got a call to wrap up. Right, so this brother says exactly what we want to say in our findings. He points out that the old-fashioned people who administer schools and run school boards tend to be inflexible. They rarely question rules and they stubbornly believe that tradition must be preserved at all costs. They do not seem to understand that their racist hair policies are designed to perpetuate self-hatred, and they resent young people who challenge them to justify their actions. So in conclusion, we must remember that every inch of cultural space that non-white people occupy in the Caribbean is space that we have fought for. Things we take for granted, like eating callaloo, doubles, roti, singing calypso, soca, and chutney, the place of steel band, the place of traditional wear and attire and religion. These are things that we've had to fight for. We've had to fight for their acceptance. Somehow in all the struggle, we drop the ball on something as fundamental as African hair. This is not a frivolous matter, and things must change because the policies and cultures of behavior that govern what happens to African hair in the 21st century have serious implications for mental and physical health, educational access, and long-term success. The politicians, those in the relevant positions in the Ministry of Education, cannot claim to be ignorant of these facts and must now reconsider their current approach and join us in seeking a legislative solution to this problem that will make a definable difference in our society. Anything less would be a gross and deliberate dereliction of duty. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Shabaka. And of course, it was a very wide-ranging presentation. And now I invite Dr. Patricia Seeley to address us. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Fergus. Good afternoon to all our viewers and listeners. And I extend hearty congratulations to the Emancipation Committee for hosting this forum, and my deepest appreciation to all of you for being invited to be part of this process. The child of African descent living in Trinidad and Tobago, derogatorily called them Black children, come from the African cohort that makes up 32.4% of the population of Trinidad and 85.2% of the population of Tobago. Our elitist society has relegated them in the main to schools that struggle for resources, schools that are labeled either high risk or under academic watch. The psychological denudation of their minds for a long period of time in the past bore the outward stamp of plaid uniforms that was contrasted to the monoculture uniform worn by privileged, prestige students. This branding done during slavery continued in our contemporary society through the labeling of schools, the type of uniforms worn, and the narrative that the African child is unintelligent. In fact, an academic curriculum was not suited for such a child, who in societal view should be relegated to a trade school. Such are the mitigating factors of the African child, spawned by a society that has failed to have open dialogue about the ills of slavery or sought comprehensive strategies to heal the deep psychological scars that African children bear to this day. The discrimination in the education system is real and is evident in the driving force of education, the curriculum. The greatest protagonist spawned by this curriculum is the Secondary Entrance Assessment Examination, the SEA. It divides the so-called wheat from the tares at age 11 plus. In Trinidad and Tobago, the preschool, the primary school, and importantly, the secondary school that a child attends determine life chances. According to the Education Sector Strategy Plan 2011 to 2015, there are 173 ECCE schools, 488 primary schools, and 163 secondary schools. Education is compulsory for students ages 5 to 16. Pre-primary education, which is not compulsory, caters for children 2 to 5 years old. Students at primary school complete schooling between the ages of 5 to 12, and at 11 plus, they write this crucial high-stake examination we call SEA. In the main, if we look at the curriculum, it is well written. From early childhood to infant level, however, the African child cannot get a concept of who I am, although that's a topic on the curriculum, unless the teacher knows and can translate positive aspects of Africanism and African values. One may want to argue that we are all Trinbagonians, but let us not forget that the religion of the Hindus and the Chinese and other peoples, they have been taught value systems. For example, the caste system, one is taught that the lighter skinned person is better than the darker skinned person. Although you may not agree with this value system, the fact is that it is taught and it exists and it is referred to at schools. The lack of a specific value system, of course, can affect one's identity. And so we find that adolescents, the African youth, they strive to find that identity by associating with the criminal elements. At an early age, the child of African descent must be able to draw pictures of himself or herself, of their homes, with a high level of acceptance and encouragement from their teachers. The psyche of the African child must be understood. The African child is an energetic child who is driven to explore, to touch, to ask questions. A child who has a natural rhythm and learns through music. These characteristics from early in the African child's life are misunderstood as being abrasive, antagonistic, and even disrespectful. Most teachers try to constrain the natural disposition of African children, and so they hinder their learning. Two main subjects that could assist the African child in finding a place in the school system, history and social studies, are relegated as second-class subjects in preference to mathematics and language arts. Slavery is taught at school, but is generally omitted at the primary school. We have some evidence of it at the secondary level. The nature of the SCA exam tries all teachers to focus on maths, English language, and creative writing at Standard 4 and Standard 5. So despite the fact that we have focus on citizenship at those levels, because teachers teach to the test, the curriculum at that level is actually negated. In fact, it deprives the African child of seeing himself or herself as belonging to a country with rights and responsibilities. We know that social studies is no longer examined at SCA, and so the attention is not paid to it at all during that period. Knowing about history enriches a person and makes them well-rounded. In the words of a famous American historian and social critic and public intellectual, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., he says, and I quote, "It is useful to remember that history is to a nation as memory is to an individual. As a person deprived of memory becomes disoriented and lost, not knowing where they have been or where they are going, so a nation denied a conception of the past will be disabled in dealing with its present and its future." End of quote. I quote from Robert Heinlein, who said, "A generation which ignores its history has no past and no future." Is it any wonder that our African children are at bay and that are lost? So we ask the question, what aspects of our curriculum actually focuses on the Black inventors, on African kings and queens, of the mother or grandmother's medicinal cures that have come down through the generation, or even the contemporary Black icons in our society? And I can tell you from experience that those areas are extremely limited or non-existent. So while the African children are fighting like crabs in a barrel, the Syrians, the Portuguese, the Chinese, and the East Indians are upheld in the curriculum as business owners, farmers, and productive contributors to the national development. No one tells the African child that there are specific tribes which are well known for excellence in business. In fact, no one tells the African child that you belong to a tribe. Slavery destroyed tribal lineage and all its familial implications. Whereas other family and businesses and races and so on, they have the family aspect where students after school can enter into those areas even while they are at school. The African child finds himself or herself continuously being discouraged. So if you are failing at school, there is no way that you can pursue a non-academic area that will lead to your success. And so I turn to our history books that is filled with misinformation of African children who have never been taught African culture. In fact, we are not even supposed to be called the West Indies, but that's inside of our books. So the African child constantly sees negative influences in the history books, more so than any other race in Trinidad and Tobago. Without a doubt, the curriculum does not represent the student body. And I gave you the percentage of African people in Trinidad and Tobago, significant population, and we cannot see the representation of Africans within our school textbooks. The mere inclusion of emancipation at the end of the school year in June or July is certainly not enough. And one may argue that other races do not have comprehensive history books in our schools. However, if you study the races, the African child will seem to have the worst treatment of ancestors because very little is taught of slavery, compared to the Indian child who would see indentureship and see that his or her ancestors came out from their own will to work in exchange for money and land. The journey to their ancestors, of course, it wasn't perfect by no means, but it was not the horror story like the Africans. The curriculum has failed to show any aspect of resiliency of a race like the Africans who have survived the traumas of slavery and still today can hold their heads up high. That resiliency must be taught to our children. Curriculum determines the academic formation of this generation and generations to come. In other words, it helps to create people who think in a particular way about particular subjects and who talk a particular language and a particular idiom. It is an excellent place to plant seeds of transformation. And so we try to get our teachers to use a thematic approach. But many of the concepts taught at primary school are taught by means of rote. And so it makes the aspect of integrated curriculum or thematic approach problematic. I was involved in the secondary education modernization program, in which we did the reform of all the syllabus and the different types of curricula at the secondary school from 2000 coming forward. And it was sad that the foreign specialists guided that curriculum development or curriculum reform, however we want to call it. People from Canada and USA who had no concept of our culture. They came to tell us what we should do in our curriculum in the year 2000. Although they brought certain aspects of it and they said, okay, we're going to look at problem solving and communication and citizenship and all of these type of great technological competence. The fact is that when we get down to the crunch, teachers teach to the test. And once these things are not examinable at the critical aspects of the student's development, the teachers will not teach. And so what we have is that teachers resort to the normal choke and talk method. And we know the ills of that method. What we saw coming out of the COVID environment, it brought to the fore the great disparity that African children suffer in comparison to the other races. They couldn't get online. They didn't have devices. Their reading was really poor, and their writing levels dropped. The implication for the national testing that will come on board next year within the school system, national testing at standard 1 and standard 3, I am sure it will show the great disparity. And it is unfortunate that when the Ministry of Education publishes the results of any critical examination, they do not give the breakdown in races. And I think that is something that we should demand, because we want to see for sure not only what is happening and who got what in what type of school, we want to see the racial composition inside of these results. And so we look at the causes, the failure of a society to dialogue about the ills of slavery, the powerful negative influence of the media and the social platforms, the psychological damaging narratives in the public domain, The value system in the homes that run counter to that of the schools. And we have to speak to the parents that they have to change their value system and they have to get on board and focus more on education. The failure of administrators, teachers, and society as a whole to look down upon the African child, suspending them and referring them to the guidance officer and the community police, those are punitive, counterproductive strategies. In the year 2022, we should not be treating with those strategies. There is a practice that prevails within the classroom, despite legislation that counteract that and say this should not be done. But the African child is put to stand up at the back of the class, or the African child, worse yet, is put out of the class, despite the Ministry of Education's instructions that teachers should not do that. And so that we find that teachers are preferential in their teaching. They teach to their race. And it is known that if you're an East Indian teacher, you gather your East Indian children around you and you teach them and you leave the African children outside. This we have to bring to the fore. We have to speak about this racial thing, pure and raw, and very much to the fore without offending people, but in an effort to bring about a solution. And so we look at the Ministry of Education Academic Performance Index and the demographic clusters of our population. And we look at Tobago being 85% plus Africans, but we do not hear about the successes in Tobago. And we juxtapose all of that against the Ministry of Education's policy that says every child can learn and should be given the opportunity to do so. If we go on the premise of that philosophy of the Ministry of Education that we tout all the time, we are failing as a society to successfully educate the child of African descent. We must enter the areas in which they live. The Savo Lafontaine, the East-West Corridor, the Congo, the Point 14, and see what happens in those communities as against what is happening in Shokona, Spinal, Debe, and Princeton that are mainly East Indian populated. We want to know what is contributing to the factors of the achievement gap. The achievement gap is real and it is problematic. So that families, communities, and wider societies are suffering because of that. I want to draw on two of my researches because I think they are pertinent in this area. I looked at 18 policies for youth development in education, and only 3 of those policies address at-risk African children. In another study on pre-service teachers, I found that pre-service teachers could not teach socially sensitive issues. And these are the issues that are in the affective domain and the issues that will impact upon the African child's psyche and development. Therefore, we need to re-examine education policies. We need to re-examine teacher training. And we need to re-examine what we do with our African children inside of the education system. I close with words from the late Desmond Tutu, anti-apartheid leader. And I quote, "Exclusion is not the way forward on our shared path to freedom and justice." End of quote. I plead that for all of us as a society will embrace the African child, revisit our education offerings, revisit the curriculum, revisit how we treat with them on a psychological basis, on a daily basis, revisit our parents and how they prioritize their values in their homes, and get them on board to realize that education is the way forward. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seeley. We have quite a lot there to think about and to address in the next segments. What follows is a new feature of our Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series, and I will welcome your feedback. That is the viewers and the listening audience. We have 2 key respondents who will address some of the issues raised so far by the 2 keynote speakers. And while they are addressing those issues, they would, of course, add their own hands-on experience, activism, and successes. First, we will hear a pre-recorded presentation from Sister Abna Nyako. Sister Abna is Ghanaian, and she sent us this recording from Ghana. She's currently studying for her master's in business administration at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. The topic embraces multi-layered discrimination in schools and an ongoing natural hair revolution, which she has helped to kickstart in Ghana. She speaks from a personal experience from a stage in her life that she describes as being thoroughly colonized, a colonized victim, to becoming a conscious and proud to be African woman. I must say that she was my student while I was in Ghana at Ghana University, and I probably played some role in that. I did address the hair issue there, and I'm proud to say that she's one of the products coming out of that. Next, we will hear from Reverend Kwame Kamo. Brother Kamo is a specialist in communications, including broadcasting, motivational speaking, and writing. He's an African reparations minister and the advocate of Trinidad and Tobago chapter of All Mansions of Rastafari. He is also ambassador and the international spokesperson of the United States-based Congress of African People. He is a specialist in and a strong advocate for homeschooling. I want to welcome both. Each will have 5 to 6 minutes to address those issues. Let's hear Sister Abna Nyako.
Everyone, and a warm greetings from Ghana. My name is Abna Nyako. Let me use my own self as an example in this discussion. I just couldn't wait to complete school because we were not allowed to do anything to our hair. We were supposed to come to school with our natural hair, a low cut that you could comb. Until you complete secondary school, that is all that you could do. Interestingly, those who came to school with silky hair, claiming that they're coming from Europe, were allowed to come to school, but we were allowed to cut their hair no matter how you wanted to keep it. And so we all were eager to leave school just to get our hair permed, especially the women. Wear wigs. We had been made to understand that having a silky hair and a light skin complexion were the standard for beauty. And so everybody, including myself, thought and believed that to look beautiful, you needed to have a silky hair. And so we tormented ourselves by applying harsh chemicals to our hair just to make it look silky. We didn't know we were tormenting our minds. We were tormenting our scalp. We were tormenting our skin. In fact, our whole body, we were tormenting it. Our teachers then, of course, they were also victims of colonialism, and so penalized us for speaking our own language. That is our Oluka dialect, that is Twi, the national language. So we were forced to speak English at the expense of Twi. We were penalized, not just forced, we were penalized. Why? These teachers had everything in their minds colonized. But the situation is gradually changing. Honestly, it's changing. As I speak to you today, some prominent individuals like Dr. Kweku Mensah, he is a lecturer at the University of Professional Studies. He is advocating for the use of local dialects, particularly Twi, as a medium of instructions. Same way as our former education minister, Professor Nana Jane Opoku-Agyeman, on August 26th gave a specific instruction to heads and teachers of basic school to desist from the use of the English language as the sole medium of instruction in the classroom. And she was even advocating that they use our local dialect to teach the children at that level. And there was a recent issue in Achimota School. Achimota School is a senior high school of a high repute. It's really regarded one of the best schools in Ghana. There was an incident of 2 boys in the first year. These boys had dreadlocks. it became a national issue because Achimota School didn't want to admit these children for the fact that they had dreadlocks. And so these children, it was back and forth to the extent that even lawyers came in. They took the issue to court. Yes, at the end of the day, they were admitted. One thing that I'm so excited about when I'm talking about colonialism is the fact that in Ghana, a lot of women are shying away from using chemicals on their hair and buying Brazilian hair, just as I was eager to do when I was in secondary school. In fact, some of our top celebrities, if they are all natural hair, it will interest you to know that even our former First Lady, Lordina Mahama, and she has dreadlocks, beautifully worn anywhere she goes. In my own church, I had to organize some people. In fact, that was when my eyes opened. I also started the advocacy. I organized some small groups in my church, educated them on the effect of these hairs, and I can proudly say today that half of my people in church, the congregation, the women at least in it, half of them now have natural hair, and they are flaunting it beautifully. Same way in my workplace, I have about 10 women. When I joined the institution, 2 having natural hair. I had to advocate for that. I did a lot of education on that to a lot of them. And now I am saying out of the 10, 7 of them have natural hair today. Natural hair, not permed, and it is beautiful. Before having our eyes opened, that is what I always call it. The things that I was doing before I met Dr. Fergus, who made me understand and brought meaning to me in so many things. I call that stage the blind stage. But until I met Dr. Fergus, he is the mentor I've been talking about. Yes, he is my mentor. Until I met him, I did a lot of things wrong. But having encountered him, my eyes open, my mind open, and I could understand and appreciate things. He brought a lot of meaning to history to me. And so let me say, yes, our African settings have changed so much, especially in educational settings. Languages have changed. You can go to school now with any kind of hair, and no teacher or hair teacher can question you. So there has been a tremendous change. I'm just praying that those left behind will be able to catch up and also stand firm on some of these things. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope we meet next time to talk more about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very informative piece, Sister Abner. And I appreciate your advocacy and your contribution to transforming your society. I now invite Brother Kwame to respond to the 2 speakers.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I would first like to salute Baba Claudius Fergus, a mentor, should I say more accurately and more Afrocentrically, a Jegna to me as well. And so the sister and I, we share that in common. As it relates to responding to these 2 very prolific speakers and the depth and the great richness that they contributed today, I would first wish to begin by engaging and overstanding, as Rastafari would like to say, that with regards to our education system, which forms part of our neo-colonial project in Trinidad and Tobago, there are indeed 3 layers at the very least that concerns me. The first layer has to do with the very intent itself. For European phenomenology, the white burden, the idea that the European had to civilize the subject races in the various spaces that they entered into forcibly, certainly continued well within the colonial project and the post-colonial, neo-colonial project. So by way of intent, looking at the education system as it exists right now, which comes from the Prussian model, that old German model, which seeks really to create individuals who are designed to, again, carry out white supremacy and to fulfill its objectives, can in no way, as an institution, be appropriate for anyone who is seeking to get agency and seeking to, as it were, beyond agency, to experience the full phenomenon of selfhood or actualization. So intent is very important. The education system, by way of intent, started off in white supremacy and still continues in that regard. By way of content, there's also discrimination there. For we see that with regards to the content, there's discrimination also beyond the personhood of the individual in terms of their natural hair, the complexion of their skin, and these types of personal, deeply personal things. There's also discrimination in terms of the curriculum, the content, the subject matter. We have a lot of chalk and talk, as mentioned by one of our prolific speakers, in Trinidad and Tobago. And so when one considers that there are multiple intelligences, so far we've counted at least 12 of them. I would take us through the gauntlet of all of these 12 modalities of the multiple intelligences. But the very design and the content and the curriculum, the delivery, the pedagogy, as it were, discriminates not only against African children, but against a number of individuals whose learning style, whose particular modality of learning does not fit into the chalk and talk, does not fit into, as it were, the mathematical logical, does not fit into the linguistic model. There are 10 others besides that, and these are not challenged. These are not certainly developed. And Albert Einstein is very, very correct in his quote when he said that learning takes place when one has left or forgotten what one learned in school. And so it behooves us then, therefore, to recognize that beyond and besides the discrimination as meted out against our complexion, against our hairstyle, against our culture, those who wear dreadlock hairstyles, those who engage in certain cultural and religious symbols that have been outlawed in Trinidad and Tobago, I want to remind us that the very system design in terms of the content is also very, very discriminatory as well. And then, of course, last but not least, I would want to make mention of the fact that by way of relevance, the education system that is engaged in Trinidad and Tobago is deeply irrelevant to the African for a number of reasons. Number one, it is not reparatory in nature. And anyone that has gone through chattel slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism in a space where white is right, yellow is mellow, brown stick around, and if you're black, get to the back. Someone who has gone through that kind of deep psychological trauma needs within an education system that is relevant to them to cater to and to identify this trauma and seek to, as it were, to be remedial, to bring an end to it by way of not only the diagnosis of it, but those very necessary components that would seek to treat, that would seek to heal. And so from that perspective, I see the need absolutely for interventions as it relates to this systematic, this mainstream education system, and it begins at home. Homeschooling is certainly an option for those of us who want the intent, the content, and the relevance of the education to be certainly something that empowers the African child and the African person in general. Beyond, of course, homeschooling as a means and as a choice, we certainly have to advocate for the greater use of Ubuntu, the greater use of culturally relevant and humane, humanity-sensitive, multicultural perspectives within our mainstream education, within not only Trinidad and Tobago, but wherever there are Black and brown persons throughout the world. And so if we get the job right as it relates to one, the decolonization of our education spaces, the mainstream one, and if we certainly take the bull by the horn, and if we engage certain aspects ourselves by way of homeschooling, I believe that that would certainly be the beginning of the answer to the question and to the problem as it relates to the discrimination that we face. Of course, there are many others, but with the limited time that I have for this first response, I would recess there and yield any time that I have on the clock. I thank you so much.
Thank you, Brother Kwame. You are spot on with your time control. Thank you very much. Let's go back to our two keynote speakers for their reaction to these interventions. We will hear from Dr. Seeley first, but we were supposed to have three respondents. Since we have two, let me take advantage of that and add a concern of mine to the two keynote speakers to address. Dr. Seeley, you mentioned Hinduism and colorism. The African identity crisis was really entrenched by what I would call the Europo-Christian project of white supremacy, of which the Anglican Church was at center with the Roman Catholic Church. As a new deacon, I want to put you on the spot, but I think you said, we need to speak to the issues. So as a new deacon, how can you deal with such an issue within your church organization to deconstruct the damage that has been done by the Christian churches to the African mind, a damage which persists today and which is also part of our education system? So over to you, Dr. Seeley, to respond to either any of the issues that have been raised, and if you wish to address this one that I've raised as well. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Let me look at your question, Dr. Ferguson, and your concerns are real. We have come out in the Christian education aspect from the colonial people. And we know that we started off within our school systems where we imported our foreign teachers within the system. It was probably just before, or could say probably after emancipation in the early 1900s, that we actually started to train teachers a little at a time in order to conduct our education system. But even that training was saturated to a great deal with the European and our British aspect within it. And I want to pull the point that we have fought for a long time to even introduce the vernacular into our school system. Everything and every examination that we write, we must write in standard English. And our students come with a second language. And when I say our students, I'm talking about all Trinbagonians. They come with a second language, our vernacular. But the problem is, and the problem will go back to us as people, we have not been able to find a standardized way of treating with the vernacular. Every one of us, when we write the vernacular, we will write a word in a different spelling. So unless and until we can get that spelling down, unless and until we know that there is a grammatical structure, but can we come to an agreement of what that vernacular structure is going to be? We have not been able to come to an agreement. So yes, we have that within it, and our students come with this language and they have to learn English. And I will say it is like learning a second language, and they are troubled and they are challenged and they have a lot of problems in learning this second language. Now, if the language of the home is also the language of the school, and it's a point that I made, that we have to get the parents in the home speaking the language of the school as it exists. If the language at the home is not the language of the school, you will find that the children get even greater problems within it. And so we come back to what are the churches doing? The churches who have promoted this Eurocentric aspect of it. And I can tell you that in our schools, and I can speak for the Anglican schools, we are treating with that seriously. We are training our teachers in different ways. We are speaking to our students in different ways, and we are bringing about results in different ways. It takes time because we know that with the generations, it is easier to do it with the younger people. But with the older generations who are stuck in their ways, we have the problem of bringing them on board, of understanding what it is we have to do. And yes, when we look at the entire aspect of what our curriculum is doing, what we are doing in education for our African children, what we are actually offering them in terms of the different intelligences, and I will refer to Brother Kwame's concern in that once the test, and I go back to it because I mentioned it, once the test is structured a certain way, and the SEA, which is the critical aspect of it at 11 plus, we are weeding out students at 11 plus. We are determining a child's future at 11 plus. And that is critical. So at 11 plus, you are doomed or you are going to survive. And that is unfair to any 11 plus child. So we have the mathematics and the language arts and the creative writing being what we examine. And once these are the things that we examine, the other intelligences that you are talking about, and the irony of it, Brother Kwame, is that the teachers are trained in colleges and at our education system. They are trained in all the different types of intelligences. Howard Gardner is one of their favorite theorists. And they know all the different intelligences. In their practicum, when they have to do their examinations, they will teach with the different intelligences being addressed. But when they get into the school system, what does the school do? We are looking at bringing in national testing next year for standard 1 and standard 3. And what will be the nature of national testing? Maths and language. So what happens to the other intelligences that we know and we talk about and we write about? And you know, it's a narrative that goes through the entire system. But until we change the structure of the examination, we will not get teachers looking at the other areas, and we will not get the students who are proficient in the other areas rising to the fore. And it will take political will. It will take really strong people to go against the grain of what society is saying and change that SCA exam. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Seeley. Brother Shabaka, your reaction to the comments? You can come in now. Unmute, please.
Yes, I simply want to highlight the contribution of our colleague from Ghana. I think it's so profound for us in the Caribbean to grow in the understanding that our brothers and sisters on the continent were victims of a similar kind of violent colonial process. And we are all on a similar journey to the liberation of our minds and the creation of spaces that are truly that can truly be useful in moving our peoples forward. So, I mean, that her testimony was incredible, and you know, for all those who would have witnessed it, is something else. Thank you.
Okay, so you don't want to respond to our local commentators on the presentation?
Well, I think that Dr. Seeley and Brother Kamau both touched on something that is important to me, that question of the content of the education system. You know, I've often said that in 1962, when we became independent, we made a noble effort to try to prepare our citizens to participate in the democracies that we were setting up. Unfortunately, we unwittingly expanded the impact of epistemic colonial violence because we focused on organization and quantity in schools rather than on the content of the curriculum. And over time, we see the impact of that in our society all around us. And in fact, the gap that we see between scores of African people and so on is partly the result of that failure on our part. And I wouldn't say just a failure. As I said, we expanded. We didn't undermine anyway. We expanded the reach of epistemic violence because the colonials, despite all their claims to humanizing and to civilizing, when they left in 1962, almost 80% of people across the Caribbean were functionally illiterate. And so we were the ones who created this literate society, but we utilized the poison material that was given to us by the colonials to do it. So I second the point of my colleagues.
Thank you very much, my brother. I believe we have Sister Abner on the StreamYard in the house somewhere now, so we might be bringing her in anytime so that you can see her live. But in the meantime, we have another feature of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series that is new. Please, Rene, if you're hearing me anytime, you can intervene and bring in Sister Abena. Okay, so we have in the house 2 individuals who would lead the question and answer. We have Brother Adeyemi Hines and Sister Akinde Rudder. Sister Akinde is a project manager and the president of the Traditional African Women's Organization, TAWO. She is the secretary to the Traditional African National Association, TANA, and she is also a community mobilizer. Adeyemi Hines is a director of In Our Image, a social enterprise that provides educational material and images that seek to educate and empower individuals and communities, particularly those suffering multiple indices. Adeyemi Hines is a qualified youth and community worker with over 30 years experience of working with communities and young people in both formal and informal settings in the United Kingdom, Africa, and the Caribbean. He's currently the education officer for the Southern Emancipation and shares his experience with a number of civic society organizations and individuals. Each of the questions will have 2 to 3 minutes. Civic society organizations. So let me invite first Sister Akinde to ask the first question. You have 2 to 3 minutes, Sister Akinde. Welcome.
Good afternoon, each and everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to such a very, very important discussion this afternoon. All the presenters so far have touched on all the different areas that we have raised over the years, and I am hoping at this stage, with all the statistics, all the facts, all the evidence, I'm asking what would be the way forward, because between 1962 to now, we have witnessed a number of reversal in the African community, in schools, at workplace, and even simple things that our African children is trying to acquire. There is a reversal, there is a heavier struggle for our African children to be acknowledged. The here is a horror story. So from colonial days to now, we even in the decade for people of African descent, and we need solutions, and not just solutions in a way that we talk about it. We need strong people. I agree with Reverend Dr. Seeley that we really need strong African minds, bodies, and spirit at this time to reverse the reversal of the hard work that our ancestors has done over the years, and move forward and push forward to save our young people who are under attack.
Thank you very much. We will take the two questions first, and I want to put Brother Kwame on standby. I would want you to be added to the responders to these two questions as well. Brother Ayedemi, your question. Welcome.
Greetings, good afternoon, and I'm very happy to be part of this very important issue. I would like to commend the Emancipation Support Committee for actually doing this, because within the committee itself, we have discussed these issues over and over and over again. I would just like to, a quick quote from Baba Asa Hilliard, who warns us that unless we expose our children to African-centered education, we're creating another lost generation. As Baba Malcolm said, if we send our children to Rome to learn and they come back as Romans, we cannot be surprised. I'm an advocate at this point in time for setting up our own school. But I'm also aware that we have to continue to fight underground in terms of making some serious inroads to the political will and to the issue of in the recent commentary from the Prime Minister, he said he's going to address violence in the society. And as Brother Campbell said, the violence in terms of the curriculum and the education system and the whole colonial narrative is very much still evident. So my question is this: as Sister West said, the way forward, I want to ask, what concrete steps do we need to take now on both fronts? Not only our own, beginning to provide our own education institutions, but also in terms of addressing the inadequacies of the current system.
Thank you very much, Brother Ayedemi. And the two questions, let me just sum them up. Sister Kende wants to know about the way forward, and Brother Ayedemi, virtually along the same line, wants to know what concrete steps do we take now to address these urgent issues. So let us take a response from Brother Shabaka first, then Dr. Seeley, then Brother Kwame. Over to you, Brother Shabaka. Quickly, quick response to these questions.
I noticed that there are one or two commenters in the section who.
No, don't address those yet. Don't address those yet.
I'm just gonna intertwine the whole thing quickly. Who feel that the here issue is not a serious one. I'm just gonna give an answer by pointing to the story that was one of the stories that was given on the Indaba program by the parent of a young man who was the victim of this type of abuse. The boy actually grew up in the UK. He spent his first formative years in the UK. And while he was there, she's in a generally white environment. The white kids thought his hair was nice and they made him feel proud of his hair. And he came back to Trinidad, confident, bubbly, lovely boy. I met him, as I said. And one day she found this young man standing in front of the mirror in the morning before school, using soap. He had pasted the soap and plastered it in his hair, and he was combing and combing and combing his hair to try to slick it down. And when she asked him what was wrong, it is then that he revealed that his teacher had been terrorizing him and telling him that his hair was not appropriate for school and so on. And this hair was less than 1 centimeter long. That child was damaged by that experience. This is how serious, when we talk about colonial violence and we talk about things like this, it might not seem serious, but people are being hurt and traumatized by the legacy of colonial violence in our society. Now, to the question, as I said in my presentation, we have determined that the status quo as it exists now is not enough to protect our children. And Sister Zakia, under her leadership, she has sought to find a remedy that transcends the traditional methods of advocacy, which were popular coming out in the 1970s, of consciousness raising and so on, and to join those activists in the 21st century who are seeking legislation. So we are going to announce, the Emancipation Support Committee is going to announce, I'm not going to preempt it. Sister Zakia, the chair of the organization, will do that on her own terms. The date when we will launch a task force made up of prominent citizens to seek legislation to protect African hair and African hairstyles, because we understand the damage being done to our young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Silly. Dr.
Okay.
Silly, you can come in.
Yeah, thank you. We ask about the way forward. We have to, apart from the task force, we must have a concrete plan that we can put forward to the Minister of Education, because the Minister of Education is the person who must sign off on curricula at the schools. So it does not matter that if you go to a principal directly, you cannot get anything inside of the curriculum. You can also try to speak to the people who develop the curriculum officers. But in the main, you still have to get right back to the Minister of Education. So my bet is that you have a proposal and you ask for an audience with the Minister of Education, and you must have a comprehensive way of what you would really like included inside of the curriculum. It will also mean that you have, in the short term, to start developing materials for a book, or materials that could be used for handouts or something that will augment what it is you are asking the minister to do. Because it is not going to be the minister, you go to her and she says, okay, yes, I'm going to do it, because then she will ask, but there are other groups. And if I start to push this group, what will other groups do? So in your proposal too, you can ask to work with other groups, put it to the fore, so that you're not moving on your own. Yes, they are seeking the African children, but if other groups would like to join in, to seek for their groups. But we want to go forward. So in that way, it is not looking as if you are just not thinking about our cosmopolitan society, but you want to get your African children inside of their content. You must have literature to use for them. And you must find an audience with the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Dr. Silly. And Brother Kwame? Come in, please. Yes. Go ahead, Brother Kwame. Unmute.
Brother Kwame seems to be frozen.
Unmute, Brother Kwame, and continue talking. You don't look at the screen. You just continue. Unmute and continue and start speaking. Okay, when he solves that problem, we will get back to him. Okay, so we have, at this point, I want to thank all of the contributors so far, and we would go on to our viewers and hear what they are saying. We have the first question here. We have two questions. I would pose the two questions, and anyone can address either or both of them. What do you recommend as an immediate and primary action for teacher education to be more inclusive of Africa-centric educational frameworks in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the wider Caribbean and the Americas? How best to introduce a revolutionary change for the CXC examinations? How do we shift teacher education programs by September? That is September this year. That's one package of questions there. Second, is it possible to address for all of us the importance of psychological esteem to learning? I know persons who feel that attention to hear is superficial and the real problem is learning and curriculum. Can you comment on how it is all intertwined? Those two questions. First, I would ask the two keynote presenters to address them, and then anyone of the other questionnaires or respondents, you are free to add your input.
Okay, I will come in and address the aspect where someone is asking for the concern of what we are going to do by September 2022. We are in July and schools are basically closed. They will not be reopened until September. Our curricula is developed in such a way that there is planning and all our courses will be developed and have been developed to run for September, so that those things are already in place. So to say that we are going to be able to shift something for September 2022, it is not something that is easy to do. However, what we can do, we can start the dialogue, and I can speak specifically for UTT at which I work, that you can seek an audience with the people who are in practicum, the people who actually go to design the aspects of how the teachers will go out to teach in their practices. And we can speak to them and we can see if we can get in some part of inclusion of where we are going to be looking at strategies for the African children. But you will have to seek an audience with the person in charge of the curriculum and the person in charge of the UTT in the teacher training aspect, and you will have to seek that urgently. Now, we are closing down. When I say closing down, because we are finishing our third semester and people are actually going on vacation within the next 2 weeks. So to actually access staff for 2022, because this is your concern for September 2022, that is going to be really, really problematic. But you can try.
Well, Shabaka, any of those?
Let me just jump in there quickly in terms of next steps. My experience as an activist tells me that we will not gain any traction with the authorities in this country unless we can turn an issue into something that is prominent. Because the prevailing tendency among the authorities is to believe, to bury their heads in the sand and to think once there's no scandal associated with it, let's leave it and hope for the best. And so I think the first thing we have to do is to address the textbooks, particularly primary school level, that are out and out racist, that carry omissions or additions in them that undermine the mental health, the psychological state of our people. There are textbooks that we've identified that that promote all the holidays and festivities of one group and ignore things like emancipation in favor of Halloween. We talked about the fact that social studies and history have the potential to uplift our people. They also have the potential to destroy what little we have gained or fought for coming out of colonialism. And we have to look at the textbooks that carry narratives in those areas in particular that are dangerous, and we have to protest them now. We've talked about them for a long period of time. At the center of all this epistemic violence, of course, is the hero worship of Christopher Columbus, who initiated the genocide of the indigenous people and the transatlantic slave trade. Any book that chooses to lionize or to venerate such a person is contributing to anti-democratic and racist values in our society. And those are the kinds of things we have to address immediately. We could stop that tomorrow if we were to collectively decide that it should end. And I want people to understand that all these issues are intertwined. As you get one to fall, the others will fall in place. They are all connected. There's a reason why some people don't want you to move the statue of Christopher Columbus in town. That is it's a domino. Once that domino falls, a lot of other things then become visible and easily addressed. So we have to start with the low-hanging fruit and move on from there.
Okay, Sister Akinde or Brother Ayodemi, I see Brother Kwame is back. So let's go to Brother Kwame. Unmute, please. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so very much for the opportunity to weigh in very quickly. Ways forward, practical steps. What can we do now? I like to begin with the man in the mirror. Even as an African reparations minister, I don't take the issue of reparations to the external forces, UK, US, and other European forces. I look within and I ask the African and I ask our people, what can we do for ourselves in terms of internal reparations? And so if I were to ask that question as it relates to education as one of the components that we definitely have to reparate, I would then begin with the whole issue of decolonizing and reparating our spaces, our community spaces. Let's talk about sport. There is discrimination in sport. And so again, because we are talking about multiple intelligences and because Africans are very prolific in sport, in many instances, we are overrepresented in that area because again of skill and competence naturally. However, within sport, we find that there is discrimination there against our hair type, also by way of even naturally occurring testosterone, not only in the men, but also in the women as well. They are being asked to reduce their testosterone levels in order to compete, when, of course, the same is not being asked of persons who are coming in, within the spectrum in terms of transgender, and of course, so we have to be very, very clear that we have spaces that we have control over, that we can begin some work now. As a reverend, I have begun a work in terms of decolonizing the church, and I have made it very, very, very clear that certainly with regards to Yeshua, with regards to the angels, and with regards to other prophets and patriarchs in the Bible, that they are people of color. This is known in the book of Revelation. We have chapter 1, verse 14, hair like wool, and of course his feet, as it were, brass burnt in an oven. And so there's a lot that we can do now. We don't have to wait for the government in terms of decolonizing our churches, starting with taking down some of those white European, Eurocentric statues and paintings in favor of the true representation of course, Palestine in the first century, and of course, even pre-first century, going back to Moses, going back to Abraham and others. These are people of color. And so there's a lot we can do in terms of decolonizing our spaces, even in the area of culture. There's a lot that we can do as well in that regard. We see culture as classical when it is European in nature. But there's nothing classical about European culture. There is, of course, a classic, of course, represents and speaks to the issue that you have, again, a standardized process that Dr. Seeley, the illustrious Reverend, was talking about and speaking to. And we have that across the various cultures, across the various spectrum. So in sport, in the church, and certainly within culture, we can decolonize those spaces today if we want, tomorrow if we want. And there's no need, of course, to go any further than that in terms of asking and answering the question, what can we do now? I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you very much. And I'm reminded that, of course, the Emancipation Support Committee has made representations to the ministry for change in the curriculum. We have done so in writing with details of our recommendations. Of course, those are things we would have to revisit and perhaps repackage, as Brother Shabaka would have indicated there in a task force that we would be setting up. A brief comment, I am privileging our questioners. So a brief comment, keep it brief, please. Akinde and Ayademi. Anyone, go first.
Thank
Anyone of
you,
these
thank you very much for having me in this illustrious panel. I must take a word from Reverend Kwame. It is unfortunate that within our society that some of us think that the here is not as important as what should be the education system. In our society, for the African child, the first thing the teacher sees is your hair, not what's inside of your head. They analyze who you are from the time they look at your hair. Our organization, who recently we got a number of complaints that children at the secondary school level are being intimidated and harassed because of their hair. And we took a decision, start a campaign, and also put together a petition, because we think seriously that this hair that we have and born with, and there's nothing that we can do with it. It seems to me that other groups and ethnic groups know something about our hair that we don't know, because the hair situation and the hair problems that our African children and our adults are facing is not just in Trinidad and Tobago, it's not just in the Caribbean, it's all over. But we are saying enough is enough. And we are standing up and putting forward that there must have a policy for natural African hair in the school and at the workplace. As far as the education system is concerned, a number of task force, books, and a number of panel discussion has been done in the African community, among the African organization, teachers and professors who have made the research. I am saying at this time, we have the data, we have the research, we have the evidence. It's time we pick it up and stand up, step up, and start something serious. We know we have to meet the Ministry of Education, and what they do is try to pacify us. Yes, we're looking at it. We really not at that stage. We are asking that something have to be done, because our children is under attack. They are feeling inferior among everybody else. No wonder they are fighting with each other, because there are no sense of identity. There are no sense of self. There's no sense of worth. So as long as I don't feel of any worth or identity, I could attack anybody who looks like me, because I don't feel any self of worth. And if you're telling me that my hair is untidy, it's unkept, and I need to cut my hair, is obviously you would feel a sense of inferiority. What is wrong with me? Why I am the only person in my class? Yes, we have other ethnic groups, but why it is the African child is the child who faces the most discrimination and suppression, whether it's been the school books. Well, the school book has all the books you look at now is written by East Indians author. I don't know what has happened to the other authors, but a child in a primary school right now, all the books is written by one author. We have a serious problem, and we know what is the problem. We need to work on the solutions.
Thank you. But Ayademi, we are approaching the end of the session, so please try and keep it brief as possible. A brief response.
I would just like to acknowledge Sapari East School. I did a session there last week. They did African heritage. The staff of that school came together and provided a program, and they paid for it themselves. And I went in and I did a presentation on African inventors and scientists. And it was noticeable that only 2 of the hundreds of children that I addressed had any intentions of becoming a scientist or knew about some of the scientists. So I'm acknowledging the work of those teachers are doing in the school. But I would also like to observe that right next door to that school is an unfinished building that millions of pounds have been, dollars have been spent on. and is unfinished, is unkempt, is overgrown bush, and right next door is a school struggling for resources. I thank you. And thank
Thank
you
you.
very much for this program.
Thank you very much. This question says, do they not teach Caribbean history in high school anymore? I can answer that question. They do. But I would ask Dr. Seeley to tell us why so few schools teach Caribbean history. This is for Dr. Seeley.
Yes, and I go back to the aspect of when we look at what we do as the markers for success within our society. We look at the scholarships, and I can't de-emphasize those high-stake examinations. When you look at the combinations for students to get scholarships, there are specific combinations of subjects which will allow a student to get a scholarship. And so in that package of the courses and the subjects that are being offered, students will gravitate to that. The parents will send them into that. The teachers will assign them into that, because that is where you will get this scholarship. You do not get scholarships with the history. I don't know when was the last year that we had students come in and getting a scholarship in history. In fact, if you look at the passes for history at CXC and Cape, those passes are very low. And why? Because students do not gravitate to them, because they are not scholarship groupings. We have to look at that, and that is a key concern. At the SCA, since we do not have social studies examinable, they do not teach social studies. And since history is not something with which you're going to get a scholarship, they are not going to pay attention to it. So we have to look at the packages of what are the high-stake exams, because that is how people do
Thank you very much, Dr. Seeley. Brother Shabaka, I want to address this question to you. Do any of you think the entire system should be torn down and built anew from the ground up? Brother Shabaka, I want you to address that. Unmute, please, unmute.
I think that sentiment is latent in some of the commentary from one or two of the panelists. I want to say categorically that the time for us to live like maroons in the bush, organizing our own classes to run parallel to the formal system and things like that, while it is not entirely over, and it's important for us to continue to do that, the main thrust of our activities now has to be to take charge of the formal system. It is, we are no longer colonial subjects. This is our country. And, it is time now that the knowledge, and when we talk about the problems with the education system, let's be clear. Our scholars, people like Dr. Fergus, Vereen Shepherd, Hilary Beckles, those are contemporaries, Bridget Brereton, going all the way back to people like Rodney and so on who in the past, even Dr. Eric Williams, have established knowledge that is not yet in our education system. They have done the work, the scholars, the academics have done the work. It is those bodies that exist between academia and the school system that are not working for us. And this is where the thrust of activism has to come in, to make sure that the work of the scholars becomes the content of the curricula for the children of our generation.
Thank you very much. Okay, as I said, we are approaching the final few minutes, and I would take this opportunity to ask the two keynote presenters to give us their closing statements, please. I will start this time with Dr. Seeley. Your closing remarks with recommendations reiterated if you think that it's important for us to leave the session without forgetting some key points in your presentation.
Okay, thank you so very much. First, I want to say how inspiring this discussion has been. And I want to thank you for the initiative and the opportunity to participate. We are looking at the way forward, and the aspect of our African children, it's far gone. I don't want to say it's too late. I want to say that it is urgent. It is critical. It must be on our front burner. What we are seeing within our system is that probably 5 years ago, the problem we had was with the boys. But something is happening in the education system in where the girls are now in the forefront of fights and being disenchanted with school. And I heard one of the persons saying that over time something is happening that is eroding our children. So something that is happening, that it's not only our male African children being affected, but now the females who used to be people in their books studying are now the people who are rebelling. So clearly the education system is not treating with them, and it is actually eroding whatever there was. The aspect we have to act urgently. And however you feel to move forward, bring all the things that you have, all the things that you have sent before, compile them in a comprehensive way, have a strategic plan, because when you go to people with a plan of implementation, you are most likely to get there than if you are just going to ask them how to do it. Go with the means of telling them how it should be done. Bring everything else to the fore, bring it, put it down, look at the curricula inside of every area of the schools, and address those with materials that will be capable to be entered into the school system within the next few months. If you can do that, I think we would make some headway and we would make some breakthrough to help our students. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brother Shabaka, your closing statements and reiterating any points you want to leave us with to make sure that we do not forget.
Right. So I will just say something that I don't think has been stated and articulated clearly in this conversation, that I think is important. The current situation we find ourselves in, with the gap between Afro-Trinidadian students and everyone else, is the result of systematic and structural discrimination. Let me reiterate: systematic and structural discrimination. And a large part of it has to do with the sense that of the idea that there is something inherently inferior about us that has infected the society, which has allowed schools that serve our communities, particularly along the East-West corridor, to have abominable pass rate for decades without anybody being held accountable, right? If we believe that everybody was equal, as we say in our national anthem, there would be no way that a school could function for 10 years. A principal could stay in charge of that institution. The teachers could continue to collect a salary when the results are so poor from an institution for such a long time. Now, of course, if I had the opportunity to focus my area on those things, I would have come with the statistics and the details and given you an explanation, a more in-depth explanation. But let me be clear. Structural and systemic discrimination is what has to be blamed for the gap. And what we're talking about today is just some aspects and some context in which that structural discrimination takes place. So what I tried to do in my presentation was to establish the foundation, the logic of white supremacy in which we live, and to show how here and our curriculum are the products of that colonial logic. I want to salute Sister Akende and all the other activists like her who are in the trenches meeting with young people who are suffering of these issues and advocating on their behalf. Advocacy of that kind is a thankless, difficult job in a society like ours, which is so, resigned to accepting our lot. But we will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Shabaka. And I would like to thank all of the presenters on the StreamYard platform. I perhaps might say around the presentation table, the virtual table. Thanks to Dr. Patricia Seeley and Shabaka Kambon for their brilliant presentations. Brother Kwame Kamo for his excellent commentaries. Sister Adna Nyako for a well thought out presentation that captured all of the essentials that we are talking about here this evening. Sister Akinde Rudder and Brother Ayademi Hines. I want to thank the audience for being with us and for particularly those who sent in their questions and suggestions. We would deal with those after the session. I want to thank my technical team. Of course, without them, we cannot have a session like this. Thank you all very much. Those who are still behind the keyboard, I recognize your effort in ensuring that these events take place and do so quite successfully. The next panel is next Sunday, the next panel discussion, next Sunday, the 10th of July. And that one would be at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, so 1 hour before today's session. And that's because we are hosting presenters from the UK and from California. So we are trying to set a time convenient at best convenient to all. Brother Shabaka would be in the chair, and the topic is one that is currently, very much alive on both sides of the Atlantic. It is decolonizing memorials in public spaces, and you must be at that session. We have as our presenters Angela Kinlaw from the United States. She was very much involved in taking down the statues to the Confederate generals who some of those statues she was involved in take them down NOLA, that movement. In the UK, we have Gino Legal, who was involved in auditing a documentary on Thomas Picton, and she has been commissioned by the British government to work on a comprehensive work on the Atlantic slave trade. And in our sister Caribbean territory of Martinique, we have another very activist there, Ms. Alexandre Osier Lafontaine, and she had been involved in taking down and decapitating some of those monuments to French colonial criminals like Victor Schulcher and others. And she has had to pay a very, very heavy price for it, which you may hear at that panel session next week. I want to remind you that this panel this evening is the beginning of a new wave of activism to end discrimination against our children once and for all. As we indicated earlier, we are going to set up a task force or an intervention team. This is not going to be like other task forces by the government or community groups. This one, we are committing ourselves to take action to resolve this problem, and action that must be sustained until the solution that we want is achieved. If anyone in the audience, and I would prefer any legal minds, would like to assist us in this project, you can kindly contact the Emancipation Support Committee, and we are sure to welcome your intervention and your input as well. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you again on next Sunday at 4 if you are in the Eastern Caribbean, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you very much, and goodbye.